I'm Greg Wiedeman. I'm the University Archivist at Albany, and I should give a bit of a heads up that I'm probably going to kill the vibes at this conference with this talk. I hope you hear some more optimistic talks about web archives this week, but I think it's also useful to have an honest discussion of what's happening in the web archives collecting right now in the United States in college and university archives. This is a presentation about program sustainability, and I also want to thank my co-author, Amanda Greenwood, who wasn't able to make it here to IIPC this year, but is just as responsible for this work as I am. First, a little bit of backstory about our web archive program at UAlbany. In 2012, we first started our archive subscription with the Internet Archive with the goal to capture as much as our website, albany.edu, as possible. And that's because we're a public university and there's public records on the web that we're legally required to keep. At first, no one was really assigned to manage the web archive. There was an initial monthly crawl set up, and it did its work kind of for better or worse. It wasn't really scoped, and no one really touched it. In 2015, when I was hired, it was worked into the University Archivist job description as like the very minor bullet at the last and at the bottom of the job responsibilities. But I was at least able to better scope in the crawls, and we were first started to actually get all of albany.edu at that time. In 2016, we expanded to capture our outside collecting areas. We're also in a special collections and archives department, which collects organizational records and manuscripts mostly on New York State politics and death penalty activism. Much of that work happens online now. So when we get transfers of organizational records, we started crawling their websites as well. We also tried to do some topical collecting around the 2016 and 2018 state collections, but it became apparent pretty quickly that we didn't really have the resources to do that. We also noticed that our progress was creating a really big maintenance backlog. It was feasible to crawl new collections one by one, but crawls would later time out and need rescoping periodically. So while it was kind of easy to expand that way, we were actually creating a big maintenance backlog that we weren't accounting for. So I think we're pretty typical, actually. There are many college and university archives collecting the web in the U.S. The NDSA web archiving survey is a little old now, but in 2017, about 60% of respondents were from college and university archives. The Internet Archive, this is also a little old, but in 2018 reported about 60% of their partner organizations are college and university archives. That's probably different now because they've been working to diversify their partners, but just having to diversify the partners shows how dominant college and university archives are in this space. Many of these organizations are public universities, and they're collecting because of similar state records laws. It's well understood that web archives are pathetically underfunded. This is a quote from David Rosenthal. And according to those NDSA surveys, about 2/3 of respondents reported a quarter FTE devoted to web archives. And this is actually an increase from earlier versions. So if you look at this graph right here, you can see that there's actually very few web archives in this survey run by dedicated staff. And I agree with David that this looks pretty pathetic. So there's a one-year graduate assistantship that we can apply for in the library. So we got that in 2020, and the goal was to manage at that point what had grown to about 30 web archives collections and to better document New York State politics and the death penalty as we could, because we knew there was lots of stuff that we were losing. In February of 2020, Archivit 7.0 came out, which incorporated YouTube DL, which was a major advancement that helped us better crawl video content. The downside was that it helped us better crawl video content. We started getting really big data increases, and we were soon at our data budget for the year. And I was actually scheduled to go on leave in March and April of that year. So I had about 2 days at the end of February to try to roll back our crawls, try to get them to capture as minimal as possible. And we turned off a good amount of crawls just for the time being. But then a pandemic happened. So while other archives were able to shift in remote work to web archives, we were kind of frozen. And because we'd had no dedicated staff during this period, we actually lost a lot of university policies and practices during this rapidly changing period. So that was not a great position to be in. So later that year, we refocused the GA position around sort of resetting the program. We already had to rescope all of our active collections, but we also wanted to be more thoughtful about our collecting priorities and try to allocate for and limit our long-term maintenance load. We figured out that appraisal in web archives is pretty weird compared to traditional archives. When you're working with paper or born digital records, even our appraisal saves us time and labor. Like it reduces the time needed to like capture and process collections. But appraisal for web archives is different. There's very little upfront costs, so it's very easy to crawl a lot with not a lot of time dedicated to scoping. It takes a lot of time to crawl efficiently. So the lack of staff doesn't really prevent you from crawling, but it creates a lot of waste. So this makes web archives can be a really wasteful collecting method. There's lots of, I'm not sure if they're actually crawler traps. I call them crawler traps, but they're more like websites will append random strings to all these URLs, and it's hard to know what's happening. I don't know if it's React or misconfigured WordPress sites or whatnot. And there's browser-based crawling helps with a lot of this, but there's still so many sites that need really labor-intensive scoping and QA. And then also just mistakes happen with this little staff. During our 2018 crawls, I was working with a grad student who was balancing this and other duties. So we didn't really train on web archives. But he was just tasked with going and finding all the candidates' websites to use as seeds. We did an initial test crawl, but then he found another batch like a day before the election, so we got it in just in time. I didn't fully review the seed list, unfortunately, and it contained a YouTube link. So our crawler downloaded as much as YouTube as it could over the next week, which is not a place where you want to be. So I think this actually happens fairly often. And you know how I know this is because most college university archives dedicate 0.25 FTE to web archives. And also, the Archivit now is building in more and more like automated scoping rules to help with this problem and to make it a little more easy to do. And all of this is, so web archives have some really significant costs that we don't really see. The compute and storage necessary to run web crawlers are relatively cheap for us and even the Internet Archive, but we need to also allocate for the cost of servers responding to the crawler. And all of this is physical infrastructure. So when the crawler is struck in a trap forever and it's getting a lot of useless data, it's also generating emissions. Even if it's very efficient, even if you buy carbon offset credits or something, it's still generating emissions. There's also access waste, which is actually, I think, much harder to measure. The less efficient web archives are, the bigger the collections are, and the harder they are to use. So we've made some great progress, and particularly through the Archives Unleashed program and using big data tools to like working with these big collections. But it would just be things would just be a lot easier and it would lower the barrier for use if collections were smaller and more precise. The lack of research use for web archives is a pretty known problem, and I think this is a direct reflection of the lack of staff time we devote to web crawling and scoping. I know this because some of the faculty I've worked with that I've tried to convince to use web archives say if they're scraping the websites themselves, they have a lot more control over the data and they know what they're getting, and it's a lot more, actually more difficult for them to work with web archives, at least now. So this waste, this lack of opportunity for potential use is actually really hard to measure what we're missing out on. And I think we really need to further study this waste and try to like account for it in our decision making. We also try to be really thoughtful about the experience of web archives, and it turns out web archive crawling is a really time-consuming job, despite the powers of automated crawlers. Multiple test crawls are often needed now, and sometimes our crawls lasted up to 4 weeks. And one of the hard things is you have no idea when the crawl is going to finish. So you might like hope to scope the crawl on Thursday, but maybe it doesn't finish till Friday. And then you have a bunch of meetings Friday, so it gets pushed to next week, and it gets pushed further down the like priority. So it's really hard to like juggle this with other duties and like keep it at the top of the priority list. And we also have really no control over what will cause the maintenance that we need because we don't know when web types are going to change. You can have a crawl running for months or years and it could be totally fine, and then they do a platform change and it all of a sudden breaks your crawler. So our time commitment is really decided a lot by website changes and Archivit's technology changes even that we don't have a lot of control over, and it's really hard to plan for. So as Amanda, our new web archivist, it was difficult for her to get up to speed, particularly with scoping. It's not just the technology. You need to like know what HTTP codes are and what URL parameters and what's the structure of URLs. But it's more like what's going on in a host report is like a really kind of challenging skill, and oftentimes even with a lot more experience, I had no idea what was going on for a lot of crawls. And there's lots of really good documentation about how to learn to use the Archive tool and crawl the web, but there's not a lot of like documentation on like this is going to solve this individual scoping problem. So that was a major challenge. Another thing we found out, which is I think the biggest takeaway we found in this project, is that our maintenance of our web archives is increasing over time quite significantly. We know the web is getting more complex and dynamic day to day. And it's really kind of an arms race between the web technology and the archive technology trying to catch up. So now we have browser-based crawling, which means we have more tools to collect, but more tools means we have more options, which takes more time. So a lot of times we do a traditional call first, and when we have a scoping rule that we can't handle, we try a browser-based crawl on top of that. So we basically found out that the same websites take significantly more time to scope on average, even 3 to 5 years later. So this is some of the results to our from our 2020 rescoping compared to 2016, 2017. And here you can see at the first batch of crawls, there was an average about 1.5 test crawls over the course of about 30 days. So about a month juggling other duties. And this was the time until we saved a final test crawl. So only 3 to 5 years later, we found a significant increase in both the number of test crawls required, which went to almost 5, and almost the amount of time to successfully crawl, which reached over 100 days, which was a little bit stretched out by some notable examples. One of which is CSEA, which is our public workers union in New York State. So in 2016, it took 5 days to scope and capture 2 test crawls, and we ended up with no scoping rules. This past time, over the fall and winter of 2020, it took 6 months from start to finish, juggling this among another bunch of different web collections and other duties. It required 12 different test crawls, 3.5 days each, and we ended up with 10 scoping rules to get the collection properly scoped. So there's definitely a rational reason for increasing staff dedicated to web archives. As our maintenance load grows significantly over time, even capturing the same pages, we're going to need to increase our collecting time without even expanding our scope of our collections. And the other weird quirk about being in a university special collections is that collections usually come in years or decades after they're created traditionally. So if you talk to our department head who does a lot of the collecting in New York State politics, he says he's getting great collections from the 1970s right now. It's because people get older and they retire. Their political activism maybe becomes less controversial. Maybe they're better protected from harm and from potential harm, and they're more comfortable in donating their collections to us. So it's weird that we're kind of in this double period of double collecting. So now all this stuff is on the web, and it won't really last decades in many cases. So we have to collect both the 1970s and 1980s and today. So this is a really challenging thing with our level of staff. But while there's a rational reason to increase staff dedicated to web archives, there's been major staff loss in North American research libraries over the past 20 years. Specifically since 2008, you can see that there's a really significant drop in the median FTE in ARL libraries. So that's the Academic Research Libraries Association in the US. Over this time, it dropped from about 210 to 160. This has created what Aratanzi has described as a poverty cycle, where the losses compound as libraries are unable to take strategic risks and focus only on short-term needs over projects with long-term potential. This is why libraries are still focused on collecting decades in the past oftentimes, because they get more immediate value for them as researchers are using these collections now. Here again, UAlbany is unfortunately pretty typical. We had 150 FTE in the year 2000 at our library, and this year we're reporting to ARL 75 FTE for a 50% increase, which is the last down part isn't even on that graph, because that's just the ARL data that's from ARL. So why is this happening? Why are research libraries hemorrhaging staff like this? Well, unfortunately here, again, UAlbany can be a useful case study. The reason is administrators are reallocating staff from academic libraries to units that better demonstrate a direct impact on student recruitment and retention. Our provost office has made the last 10 years of staffing data open, and these numbers are a bit different than the ARL numbers because they don't include temporary or adjunct lines, but they're roughly similar. In the last 10 years, we've lost 26.7 positions for over a 27% drop. But meanwhile, the university as a whole has grown in staff, and academic affairs has grown in staff. And what's kind of most glaring to me is that our university uses functional budgeting, where we're budgeting as academic staff support. And over this period, academic staff support has actually grown by over 10%, which actually includes the library's losses, gaining over 47 positions outside the library, most of which in writing support and academic advising. So university administrators are pulling staff away from research libraries towards efforts that can get more students in the door and make sure they graduate. And this problem might get worse. There's potential for more enrollment drops around 2026, although that's kind of very noisy and hard to predict. But it doesn't seem like it's getting better. And I support our university's mission as providing an education to as broad amount of New Yorkers as possible. We're one of the few universities in the U.S. that's demographically as diverse as the state we represent. But archives and research libraries also have another mission that kind of conflicts with this. So this often gets attributed to austerity, and it is austerity, and it is also a crisis in just how American colleges and universities are resourced, but it's somehow over worse than that too. It's the lack of value for the mission of research libraries, both by university and the public. And again, here's a good example that I think we are, is that last year, New York State, like a couple of states, had a pretty unique budget surplus, and they did invest a lot in our university. The Albany AI Supercomputing Initiative includes $75 million in permanent state funding, and we got 49 new tenure track positions. So our campus is kind of buzzing with lots and lots of search committees at the moment. But we have zero positions that were hired for the university libraries. And even though that these hires reached every school and college in the university. So even when there's funding for universities, there's not really funding for our work. And unlike AI, apparently, the politicians behind a lot of this funding cannot run in their districts on support for research libraries. So it's really hard to get long-term extra funding for this way. So the really unsettling conclusions are that the lack of staff makes web archives more wasteful in ways we need to start trying to measure and account for. Even when maintaining our current collections, we need to budget in increases in maintenance over time. Faced with this reality at UAlbany, we've stopped collecting in our major subject areas. As crawls need rescoping, we just turn them off because we don't have the time to manage both the rescoping and the maintenance on top of that rescoping. So now we're back to crawling only our own website to meet our legal requirements. And what also is I think we might be a little worse off than other places, but our experience, broadly speaking, is pretty typical. This is really a long-term existential crisis for research libraries. And improvements in practice or technology really can't address these structural forces. And it's really hard in this current environment to see how this gets better. For this community at IIPC, this means we really can't rely, I don't think, on most college and university archives to preserve the web in the long term. Thank you.